The morning Charlotte Merritt walked into the general store in Caldwell, Kansas. Her boots were worn at the heel and her dress was the color of old dishwater. And not a single soul in that dusty frontier town would have guessed that the woman buying a 5-cent spool of brown thread was worth more than every building on Main Street combined. That was exactly how she wanted it. Caldwell sat at the edge of the Chisholm Trail in 1882, a cattle town that had seen its share of fortune-seekers, outlaws, and dreamers who arrived with empty pockets and left the same way. The summer heat pressed down on the high plains like a flat iron, and the red dust that blew in off the prairie coated everything: the storefronts, the water troughs, the faces of the cowboys who rode in from Texas with trail-worn horses and months of wages burning a hole in their pockets. It was a loud, restless town that smelled of cattle and wood smoke and ambition, and Charlotte Merritt had chosen it deliberately, the way she chose everything in her life, with quiet, unyielding precision. She was 28 years old, with dark auburn hair she kept pinned severely beneath a plain bonnet, and eyes the color of creek water in the shade, not quite green, not quite gray, something in between that caught the light in ways she never intended. She was not unattractive, but she worked hard to be overlooked. The dress was part of it. The stiff posture was part of it. The way she kept her chin low and her gaze practical, focused always on the task directly in front of her, as if the rest of the world were merely scenery. What she was doing in Caldwell had nothing romantic about it, or so she told herself. She had come because the town needed a school teacher, and she needed a place where nobody knew her name. More precisely, she needed a place where nobody knew her father's name. Elias Merritt, who had died 2 winters ago in St. Louis and left his only daughter a lumber empire, a silver mining interest in Nevada, and a bank account in Chicago that most men in Kansas would not earn in 3 lifetimes. She had left all of it in the hands of her father's attorney, a reliable man named Aldous Crane, who sent her quarterly letters in plain envelopes and asked very few questions. She had come west with a carpet bag, a change of clothes, and the carefully constructed fiction that she was a schoolteacher's widow of modest means. The fiction was easy to maintain because she believed, with a certainty that sometimes frightened her, that the moment anyone discovered what she was worth, she would stop being a person and become a prize. She had watched it happen to other women. She had watched the circling begin the moment a fortune became public knowledge, the sudden warmth in men's eyes that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with what she represented. She would rather die than be looked at that way. So she bought brown thread, and she taught the children of cattle drovers and homesteaders their letters and arithmetic in the one-room schoolhouse at the edge of town, and she paid her rent at the boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Elfrida Combs, and she was content, or something close enough to content that she had stopped examining the difference. The bell above the general store door chimed when she pushed it open that June morning, and the smell of the place hit her the same way it always did: sawdust and tobacco and the faint sweetness of sugar from the jars on the counter. Hector Prout, who owned the store, was arguing with someone at the far end of the counter about the price of saddlery leather, and Charlotte moved quietly along the shelves toward the thread display, her fingers already reaching for the practical shade she needed to mend the hem of her other dress. She did not look up when the argument at the counter resolved itself with a heavy sigh and the scrape of boot heels on the plank floor. She did not look up when those boot heels stopped somewhere near her left shoulder. She was examining the thread, turning the small wooden spool in her fingers to check the quality. "Pardon me," said a voice. It was not a remarkable opening. "Pardon me." 2 words anyone might say. But the voice itself had a quality she could not immediately name, low and unhurried, with the particular steadiness of a man who had been outdoors most of his life, and had learned that most things worth saying did not need to be said quickly. She looked up. Warren Yates was 29 years old, though he might have passed for older at first glance because of the sun that had carved fine lines at the corners of his eyes and across his forehead. And then at second glance, you noticed that those eyes themselves were young, brown, and direct, and carrying in them the specific kind of openness that belongs to men who have not yet had it beaten out of them. He was lean in the way of men who worked hard and ate practically, with broad shoulders and hands that were calloused in the particular places that come from rope work and reins. He wore a well-used Stetson pushed back on his head, a cotton shirt that had been washed so many times it had gone from blue to something more like sky at noon, and trail boots that were clean but not new. He was pointing at something on the shelf just past her elbow. "The blue thread," he said. "I need it for a bridle repair, and you are standing directly in front of it. I apologize for disturbing you." Charlotte looked at the shelf. There was indeed a spool of blue thread right behind her elbow, where she had not thought to look because she had not needed blue thread. "Of course," she said, and stepped aside. He reached past her, his arm close enough that she could feel the warmth of it, and took the spool from the shelf. He turned it over in his hand the same way she had turned hers, checking the quality with the same unhurried attention, and for a reason she did not immediately analyze, she found herself watching him do it. "You are particular about your thread," she said. The words came out before she had decided to say them, which was unusual for Charlotte, who was normally very deliberate. He looked at her then fully, and there was something in that look that was not appraising in the way she had learned to distrust. It was simply interested, genuinely curious, the way a person looks at something they find unexpectedly worth their attention. "My mother always said if the thread breaks, the whole thing comes apart," he said. "I figured that applied to most things beyond sewing." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is a sensible philosophy. I have very few of those," he said. "I try to hold onto the ones I have." He paid for the thread and tipped his hat and walked out of the store, and Charlotte stood there with her brown spool in her hand, and the entirely unwelcome sensation that something had just shifted slightly in the arrangement of her carefully ordered world. She told herself it was nothing. She went home and mended her hem and did not think about Warren Yates at all, except that she did think about him, at odd moments throughout the rest of that day, in the way you find yourself humming a melody you cannot quite place. She learned his name from Mrs. Combs that same evening, without meaning to. The boarding house keeper was a woman who held strong opinions about everyone in Caldwell and shared them freely at the supper table, and when Charlotte made the error of mentioning that she had encountered a man at the general store who was particular about his thread, Mrs. Combs set down her fork and lit up with recognition. "That would be Warren Yates," she said. "He came up from Texas with the Shaughnessy Drive last season and then stayed on. He is working the Bartlett Ranch now, out east of town. Honest man, which is not something you can say about half the men who pass through here. He has a small piece of land he is trying to buy back from the bank. His father lost it before he passed. Warren has been working toward it for 2 years. He seemed capable," Charlotte said carefully. "He is more than capable," Mrs. Combs said, with the particular emphasis of a woman who had formed a decided opinion. "He is the kind of man who is good all the way through, not just on the surface. You don't find that very often." Charlotte applied herself to her supper and said nothing more on the subject. But 2 days later, when she was walking back from the schoolhouse in the long afternoon light, she saw Warren Yates in the street outside the farrier's shop, talking to a group of younger cowboys who worked the Bartlett Ranch. She noticed, because she was observant by nature and by habit, that he was the one speaking when something needed to be said and listening when it did not, and that the younger men deferred to him without the kind of noisy jostling that meant deference had been forced. It was the natural deference of men who respected someone because he had earned it. He saw her, too, from across the street, and he touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement. It was a small gesture, quick and unceremonious, not a performance. She gave him a brief nod and kept walking. That was how it began, in increments so small that neither of them could have pointed to a moment and said, "There, that is where it started." Over the weeks that followed, Caldwell being the size it was, They kept crossing paths in the natural way of people who inhabit the same small space. At the church social the following Saturday, where Charlotte sat with Mrs. Combs and helped serve the lemonade, Warren arrived with two other ranch hands and ended up at the same long table. The conversation that time was longer. He asked about the school, and she told him about the particular challenge of teaching long division to children who could not yet reliably write their own names. And he listened with the focused attention of someone who found the problem genuinely interesting rather than politely tolerable. He told her he had never finished school himself, that his family had needed him working before that was possible, and that he had taught himself to read properly only in his early 20s, working through a copy of a Dickens novel that a trail boss had left behind. "Which one?" she asked. "David Copperfield," he said. "That is an ambitious place to start," she said. "I did not know that at the time," he said. "I thought all books were like that. It was a while before I discovered that was not the case." She laughed. It was not a performance of a laugh but the real thing, sudden and unguarded, and she felt the unfamiliarity of it in her own chest. She had not laughed like that in a long time. He was looking at her the way he had looked at the thread spool, with that direct and unhurried attention, and she felt the heat of it without quite knowing what to do with the feeling. "You have a good laugh," he said simply, and then turned his attention back to his plate. She did not know what she had expected him to follow that with, but the simplicity of leaving it there, stated and complete without embellishment or manipulation, left her slightly off balance in a way she found she did not entirely mind. The summer moved on. The cattle drives thundered through, and the cowboys came and went, and the town swelled and contracted with the rhythm of the season. And through all of it Charlotte taught school, and walked her careful routes, and kept her plain dresses and her plain bonnet and her carefully maintained position as a woman of no particular consequence. She wrote her quarterly letters to Aldous Crane and reviewed the figures he sent back, made decisions about the lumber contracts and the mining interest with the same quiet precision she applied to everything, and then folded those letters small and kept them in the locked box beneath her bed that contained the only real version of her life. Warren Yates did not press himself into her company. That was what she noticed most clearly about him as July burned into August. He did not engineer meetings or find pretexts to seek her out. When they happened to be in the same place, he talked to her as though she were a person whose thoughts and observations were worth having. When they were not in the same place, he seemed to have no particular anxiety about manufacturing a reason to change that. It was, she realized slowly, the most comfortable she had felt around a man since before her father died. She found herself looking forward to Sundays, which was when the ranch hands came into town and Warren was sometimes among them, and she found herself making note of when he was there and when he was not, and then finding herself quietly irritated by the noting. One Sunday in late August, there was a fire at the livery stable at the north end of Main Street. It started just before noon from a kicked-over lantern in one of the stalls, and by the time anyone raised the alarm it had taken hold in the dry hay with a ferocity that sent a column of black smoke straight up into the cloudless sky. The whole town turned out to fight it with bucket lines and wet burlap, and in the confusion and the heat and the shouting, Charlotte found herself standing at the well with her dress soaked and her bonnet knocked sideways, passing buckets hand over hand with the kind of furious physical urgency that strips away everything decorative about a person. She passed a bucket to the man beside her, and the man beside her was Warren Yates, who had his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow and his face black with smoke and his hat gone. And he took the bucket from her hands without breaking stride and flung its contents toward the flames and turned back for the next one. And for 20 minutes they worked in perfect wordless rhythm, not looking at each other because there was no time for looking, just the bucket and the water and the fire. When the fire was finally out and the livery was mostly saved, Warren turned to her. His face was grimy and he was breathing hard, and there was a long red mark on his forearm from where a burning piece of timber had come close. She saw that mark and reached into her pocket for the handkerchief she always kept there and without thinking handed it to him. He looked at the handkerchief and then at her and he said, "Thank you." It was 2 words again, the same 2 words as the first time, but the weight inside them was entirely different. She said, "You should have that seen to. Mrs. Combs keeps good salve for burns." "I will do that," he said. She straightened her bonnet and retrieved the empty buckets she had been using and walked back toward the boarding house. And she was halfway there before she realized her hands were shaking, not from cold, not from fear, but from something she had no clean name for. September arrived with a change in the air, the first real suggestion of autumn, and the cattle season began to wind toward its close. The town quieted by degrees as the last drives came through and the trail hands drifted south again. Warren Yates stayed. He was still working the Bartlett Ranch through the winter, and he was still 3 months away from having enough saved to approach the bank about his father's land. Mrs. Combs told Charlotte this without being asked, which was something Mrs. Combs did regularly, and which Charlotte had long since stopped pretending not to appreciate. It was in September that they had their first real conversation about something that mattered. The occasion was ordinary enough. Charlotte was at the post office collecting her mail, which included the latest letter from Aldous Crane, which she folded quickly and put into her pocket before turning toward the door. Warren was just coming in as she was going out, and they both stepped aside at the same moment and then both stepped back, and the awkward little dance of it made them both stop and laugh. "You first," he said, holding the door. "Thank you," she said, and went through it. He fell into step beside her on the boardwalk, which was natural given that they were going in the same direction, and she allowed it without making anything of it. "How is the school going?" he asked. "We are 12 students now," she said. 3 new families came in from Missouri last month. One of the children has never held a pencil before. She is 7 years old and her name is Nell, and she is the most determined student I have ever taught. The determined ones are the best students," he said, "or the most exhausting ones. In this case, both." He smiled. It was not a wide smile, more a deepening of something around his eyes, but it changed his whole face. They walked a bit further. The street was quiet in the mid-morning way it had before the afternoon business picked up. A wagon rolled past heading for the grain store, and a couple of dogs argued briefly outside the butcher's shop. "Can I ask you something?" he said. She looked at him sidelong. "You can ask." "Why here?" he said. "You are clearly educated. You could teach school in a dozen cities. Kansas City even. Why Caldwell?" It was a reasonable question, the kind anyone might ask, and she had a reasonable answer ready for it because she had been preparing reasonable answers for questions like this for 2 years. But something about the directness of how he asked it, not prying, not suspicious, just genuinely curious in the way she had come to associate with him, made her want to give him something more honest than the prepared answer. "I wanted to be somewhere that required something of me," she said, which was true, even if it was not the whole truth. "I wanted to be somewhere that felt real." He considered this for a moment, looking straight ahead down the street. Then he said, "I understand that. When I was moving from drive to drive, I kept thinking I needed to stop somewhere that had roots. Not roots that belonged to me necessarily, just a place where things mattered because they were connected to something. And you found that here." "I am starting to think so," he said. He said it simply, not with any particular emphasis or loaded meaning, but she felt the warmth of it settle somewhere in her chest anyway. They parted at the corner. He went left toward the feed store and she went right toward the boarding house, and Charlotte walked the rest of the way home with her hand pressed against her coat pocket, against the letter from Aldous Crane, thinking about roots and real things. October came, and with it a town meeting about the future of the Caldwell school, which the county was threatening to defund. Charlotte attended and spoke clearly and persuasively about the necessity of educating children who would otherwise grow up without the basic skills to manage their own affairs. And when she sat down, several people around her nodded seriously, and the man from the county commissioner's office looked uncomfortable in the way of officials who have encountered someone more formidable than they expected. Warren was at that meeting. He sat 3 rows behind her, and she did not know he was there until after it was over, when he came up to her in the church hall where they had gathered and said, "You spoke well." "I felt strongly about the subject," she said. "It showed." He paused. "They are not going to cut the funding now. You know that." "I know it for this year," she said. "I will come back and do this again next year if I have to." "I believe you," he said, and again that simple directness, that statement of genuine conviction, did something to the carefully maintained architecture inside her chest. They walked out together into the cool October evening, the sky so full of stars that it seemed crowded, the way prairie skies get when there is nothing between you and the horizon. "Would you like to walk a bit?" he asked. "If you are not in a hurry." She was not in a hurry, she said so. They walked along the edge of town, where the street lamps gave out, and the darkness was punctuated only by lighted windows. The air smelled of wood smoke and dry grass, and the particular clean cold that comes with prairie autumn. They talked about everything and nothing, about the way the light changed in October, about a book she had recently received from a catalog publisher in Chicago, a novel by Henry James that she was not sure she liked but could not stop reading, about the way the Bartlett Ranch operated versus the ranches he had worked in Texas, about whether the railroad expansion would change Caldwell for better or worse. "Better for trade," he said. "Worse for character, probably." "You sound like someone who prefers things difficult," she said. "I prefer things honest," he said. "Easy things are not always honest things." She stopped walking. It was not a dramatic stop, just a natural pause, but he stopped with her, and they stood there in the cool darkness with the stars very close overhead, and she looked at him and thought, for the first time without immediately retreating from the thought, that this man was someone she could trust. It was a terrifying thought. She had organized her entire life around not trusting, around keeping herself separate and contained and protected, and here it was, this thought, rising up through all those careful layers like water finding a crack. "I should go back," she said. "Of course," he said. They walked back to the edge of the lamplight and said good night, and Charlotte went to her room in the boarding house and sat on the edge of her bed for a long time with the locked box in her lap, not opening it, just holding it. November arrived cold and sharp. The last of the season's cattle drives had passed through, and Caldwell had settled into its winter character. Quieter, more contained, the daily life of a frontier town stripped of its seasonal excitement. The school continued, and Charlotte's days acquired the rhythm of the colder months. The walk to school in the frost-stiff morning air, the warmth of the schoolhouse stove, the children arriving in their heavy coats, the long afternoon return. She and Warren had fallen into the pattern of seeing each other on Sundays, when he rode in from the Bartlett Ranch, and sometimes on Wednesday evenings when there was a gathering of one kind or another at the church. The pattern had established itself without either of them formally acknowledging it, which was both comfortable and slightly alarming, and Charlotte was beginning to feel that she was approaching some kind of junction she had not prepared herself for. The thing that finally forced the issue was neither romantic nor dramatic, but entirely practical and entirely disruptive. A man named Gerald Fitch arrived in Caldwell in the second week of November. Gerald Fitch was 44 years old, from Kansas City, with a gold watch chain and a way of occupying space that was slightly too large for him. He was a business speculator, and he had come to Caldwell ostensibly to look at commercial real estate opportunities. He had also, through some connection in St. Louis that Charlotte could not immediately identify, learned that Charlotte Merritt was in the town, and he appeared at the boarding house on his second day in Caldwell and asked Mrs. Combs whether Miss Merritt was at home. Charlotte was not at home. She was at the school. But Mrs. Combs mentioned the visit that evening at supper, and the name Gerald Fitch landed on Charlotte like a cold hand on the back of her neck. She knew who he was. He had been one of the men who had circled after her father's death, not the closest or the most aggressive, but one of the ones who had appeared at the edge of things with his particular brand of smooth, commercial interest. He had looked at her then in exactly the way she had always dreaded, as though she were a figure on a balance sheet. She sat through supper with her face composed and her thoughts moving fast behind it. She did not know how he had found her. She did not know whether he had come specifically for her, or whether her presence in Caldwell was a secondary discovery alongside his commercial interests. She did not know what he would say if he sought her out again. She knew only that his presence in Caldwell was a threat to the life she had built here, because the moment Gerald Fitch spoke her real history aloud in this town, everything would change. The way people looked at her would change. The way the school board regarded her would change. And most importantly, the way Warren Yates looked at her would change, because that was what always happened when the fortune became visible, the person disappeared. She did not sleep well that night. The next morning, she walked to school with her usual composure, taught her students their letters and their sums, and a poem by Longfellow that she thought they would find pleasingly dramatic, and then walked home in the early afternoon by a route that took her past the general store, where she had seen Gerald Fitch's horse tied out front when she went by in the morning. The horse was gone. She allowed herself a small, careful breath. But he appeared the following day at the school itself, which was unexpected and deeply unwelcome. She heard the knock on the schoolhouse door at midday, and when she opened it he was standing there in his city coat and his gold watch chain, looking very much out of place against the Kansas sky. "Miss Merritt," he said, with a smile that had been designed for business meetings, "I have been hoping to speak with you." She stepped outside and closed the door behind her so that her students would not hear. "Mr. Fitch," she said, with the calmness she could produce at will when she needed it. "I cannot imagine what would bring you to my schoolhouse." "I think you can imagine," he said pleasantly. "I have interests in Caldwell that might benefit from your cooperation, and you have interests in St. Louis and Nevada and Chicago that are being managed at a distance when they might benefit from a more active partnership." She looked at him steadily. "My interests are managed to my complete satisfaction," she said. "I have nothing to discuss with you." "Charlotte," he said, and the use of her first name was deliberate and slightly threatening. "Your father and I discussed this at length before he passed. He believed you needed someone to help manage what you had inherited." This was a lie, or at best a distortion, and she knew it. Her father had trusted her absolutely. He had said so in writing. "My father is not here to speak for himself," she said. "I am managing my inheritance precisely as I choose. I would ask you to respect that and to keep any knowledge you have of my affairs to yourself. This town is my home and I intend to keep it that way." He studied her for a moment, recalculating. "You have hidden yourself very effectively," he said, and now the pleasantness was thinning at the edges. "But these things have a way of coming to light. People talk." "Goodbye, Mr. Fitch," she said. She went back inside and closed the door and leaned against it with her eyes shut for a moment, and then straightened and went back to her students and resumed the Longfellow poem. But inside, she was very afraid. Not of Gerald Fitch himself, but of what he represented, the exposure that she had spent 2 years avoiding, the loss of the ordinary life she had fought to build. And underneath that, something newer and more specifically sharp, the fear of what Warren Yates would think when he found out what she really was. The following Sunday, Warren came into town and found her at the post office, which was their most regular meeting point, and he was perceptive enough to notice immediately that something was different. "You look like a woman who has not slept enough," he said. "I have had a difficult week," she said. He looked at her for a moment with that steady attention. "Would you like to talk about it?" She almost said no. The refusal was right there, ready and practiced, the standard deflection. But she looked at him and thought about what Mrs. Combs had said, good all the way through. She thought about October and the stars and the feeling she had standing in the dark with him, the terrifying thought that she could trust him. "There is a man in town," she said. "He knows things about my past that I have kept private. I am worried about what he might say." Warren's expression did not change dramatically, but something in it settled, became more focused. "Is this man a danger to you?" "Not physically," she said. "Not in the way you mean, but his version of events could change things for me here. What things? He asked, and then, before she could deflect, only tell me what you want to tell me. I am not asking for more than that. She made a decision. It was not a full confession, she was not ready for that yet, but it was more honesty than she had offered anyone in 2 years. My father was a successful man, she said. When he died, some of what he built came to me. I came to Caldwell because I wanted to be somewhere I was judged for myself, not for what I had inherited. She watched his face. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, and this man wants to complicate that. He wants to use it, she said. Warren nodded slowly, the way he nodded when he was thinking through something carefully. Is there something I can do? She shook her head. I need to handle it myself. I wanted to tell someone. Then I am glad you told me, he said. That was all. Not a rush of questions, not a reassessment of who she was, not the particular look she had always feared. Just, I am glad you told me. A simple acknowledgement that she had shared something and that he had received it carefully. She looked at him and felt the architecture in her chest shift again, more significantly this time. Warren, she said, there is more to it than I have told you. I am not ready to tell you all of it yet. But I want you to know that when I do, and I think I will, what I am going to tell you is not meant to deceive you. He met her eyes. I already knew you were not deceiving me, he said. Whatever the specifics are, Charlotte, I know the kind of person you are. I have watched you for 5 months. She had no answer for that. She was not sure she needed one. Gerald Fitch made 2 more attempts to speak with her over the following week, once at the church and once when he caught her on the street, and both times she was firm and brief and gave him nothing to work with. But on the 4th day after his second attempt, she came home from school to find Mrs. Combs waiting for her in the parlor with an unusual expression on her face, not upset exactly, but unsettled. There was a man here today, Mrs. Combs said, talking to some of the people on the street. A city man, very polished. He was asking about you, about who your family was. Charlotte sat down carefully. What did people tell him? Nothing, Mrs. Combs said with a firmness that was deeply reassuring. Nobody here knows more than what you have told us, which is that you are a widow of modest means. But Charlotte, is there something I should know? I am not asking out of prying. I am asking because I run this house and I feel responsible for the people in it. Charlotte looked at Elfrida Combs, who was 61 years old and had buried a husband and 2 sons, and had built her boarding house with her own hands and her own money and her own absolute determination, and she felt a surge of genuine affection for this woman who had given her a home. She told her the truth. Not all of it, but enough. She told her about the lumber empire and the mining interest and the bank account. She told her about the years of circling she had endured after her father's death. She told her about why she had come to Caldwell. Mrs. Combs listened without interrupting, which was remarkable given that Mrs. Combs interrupted almost everything. When Charlotte finished, Mrs. Combs folded her hands in her lap and said, "Well, that explains the locked box." "Yes," Charlotte said. "Does Warren know?" Charlotte looked at her. "I told him some of it, not all." "You should tell him the rest," Mrs. Combs said. "Not because you owe it to anyone, but because I have watched that man watch you for 5 months, and I am quite certain he does not care about your money. I would stake this house on it." Charlotte thought about that for a long time that evening, sitting in her room with the locked box open in her lap. The letters from Aldous Crane spread around her like the paperwork of a life she had been living in 2 halves. Gerald Fitch left Caldwell 3 days later, which she found out from Hector Prout at the general store. Apparently his commercial interests in the town had not materialized as he had hoped, and he had departed on the morning stage heading back north. Charlotte felt the tension in her shoulders release by approximately half. She was not fool enough to think he was entirely gone from her life. Men like Gerald Fitch had long memories. But for now, Caldwell was safe. She could breathe. And now, with the immediate threat removed, she found herself confronting the question she had been able to partially defer while Fitch was present. What was she going to do about Warren Yates? The answer came to her not in a moment of dramatic clarity, but in the way most true things came to her, quietly, over several days like a tide coming in. She was going to tell him the truth. Not because she had decided it was strategically wise or because Mrs. Combs had advised it, but because she had been alone with her secret for 2 years and she was tired. And because the specific kind of tired she felt was not a general exhaustion, but the particular fatigue of a woman who had been carrying something heavy past a person she could ask for help, and choosing not to ask. She asked him to walk with her on the Sunday after Fitch's departure. She chose the route along the creek east of town, which was quiet in the late November cold and gave them space to talk without the ambient noise and awareness of town life. She told him everything. She started with her father, Elias Merritt, the lumber business that had begun as one small sawmill in Indiana and grown over 30 years into something with interests in 4 states, the silver mining operation in Nevada that had come later, the careful and precise mind of a man who had taught his only daughter to read a balance sheet with the same attention she brought to a novel. She told him about her father's death and the months that followed, the lawyers and the estate managers, and the men who appeared at the edges of things with polished smiles and good suits. She told him about the particular Sunday morning when she had sat in her father's house in St. Louis and understood with absolute clarity that the life she was living was going to become something she could not endure, and that she needed to leave and be someone else, or at least be only herself, stripped of everything that accumulated around her name like barnacles. She told him about Caldwell, about choosing it specifically because it was far enough and wild enough and real enough, about the plain dresses and the worn boots and the careful maintenance of a particular kind of invisibility. She told him about the locked box and the quarterly letters from Aldous Crane and the decisions she made from a boarding house room in Kansas, about a lumber empire in Indiana and a silver mine in Nevada. She told him all of it, and then she stopped walking and turned to face him, and the November wind came across the creek and moved a strand of hair across her face, and she did not push it back because her hands were not steady enough. Warren stood very still. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, and she could not quite read it, and that frightened her in a way that Fitch had not. "Say something," she said. He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "I am trying to organize my thoughts because I want to say the right thing." "Say whatever is true," she said. "All right," he said. "The first thing that is true is that I am not surprised you kept this private. Given what you described, the men appearing at the edges of things, I understand exactly why you did what you did. The second thing that is true is that it does not change a single thing I know about you, which is that you are one of the most capable and honest people I have met in my life, and the fact that you happen to have money behind the plain dress does not alter that." She absorbed this. "Just like that. Just like that," he said. "Most people would find it disorienting," she said, "learning that someone they thought they knew was someone different." "You are not someone different," he said. "You are exactly who you have always been. You just told me more about where that person came from." He paused. "Besides, I liked the plain dress long before I knew what was behind it." She looked at him, and there was something in his face, simple, direct, completely unguarded. That was the most honest thing she had seen in a very long time, and she felt something inside her that had been braced for a very long time stop bracing. "Warren," she said. "Yes. I have been afraid," she said, "for 2 years that if I let anyone know the truth they would look at me differently, that they would stop seeing me and start seeing what I had." "I see you," he said. Quietly, without ceremony, as if it were the most natural statement in the world. She stepped forward. She was not an impulsive woman. She had not been impulsive since she was about 19 years old, and even then. But she stepped forward and she put her hand on his arm, her fingers around his forearm above the wrist, and she looked up at him in the cold November air with the creek running dark and fast beside them. "I see you too," she said. It was not a kiss. Not yet. But when he covered her hand with his warm and certain over her cold and slightly trembling, it was an arrival of something that had been traveling toward them for 5 months, something that did not require a dramatic announcement because it simply, quietly, was. They walked back to town together in the early dark, and it was different from all the times they had walked before, and they both knew it. December came to Caldwell with ice in the water troughs and snow on the high plains to the north, and Warren Yates rode in from the Bartlett Ranch on Sundays with his coat, collar turned up in snow on his hat brim, and Charlotte began keeping a pot of coffee ready at the boarding house parlor, because Mrs. Combs had made it clear with tremendous satisfaction and no subtlety whatsoever that Warren was welcome to warm himself at the fire when he came to call. He came to call. Formally, by the standards of the time, which meant that he sat in the parlor with Charlotte while Mrs. Combs did noisy things in the adjacent room that never quite managed to conceal the fact that she was listening to every word. They talked about everything with the same ease they had always had, and sometimes the conversation gave way to a comfortable silence, and sometimes he read to her from whatever book she currently had. He was particular about reading aloud and had a good clear voice for it. And sometimes she told him about the letters from Aldous Crane and the decisions she had made, because she had found that talking the decisions through with him sharpened her own thinking in ways she had not expected. He was, she discovered, considerably more financially astute than his circumstances suggested. He had strong opinions about the railroad expansion and what it would do to cattle values and land prices across the territory, opinions that were sensible and well-reasoned, and that matched several things Aldous Crane had been advising. She told Warren this, which pleased him in a quiet, unshowy way. "You should be managing something of your own," she told him one evening, not thinking about how it sounded until it was out. He looked at her with a faint smile. "I am managing something of my own. 340 acres of bottom land east of the Cimarron, the moment I have enough to settle with the bank." "Which will be when?" "Spring," he said, "if winter goes smoothly." She wanted, with a fierceness that surprised her, for winter to go smoothly. She also wrote to Aldous Crane in December with an instruction that surprised the attorney, given that she had always been conservative about exposing her financial position to anyone. She asked him to send a more complete summary of the mining interest in Nevada, because she was reviewing a strategic question about whether to expand or consolidate, and she wanted to think it through carefully. She was also thinking, though she did not yet say this to Crane, about what it might mean to have a partner in these decisions. Not a manager, not an advisor like Crane himself. A partner, in the full sense of the word, which was a category of things she had not allowed herself to think about for 2 years because it required trusting someone with everything. She was beginning to think she had found someone she could trust with everything. On Christmas Eve, there was a gathering at the church, the way there was every year in Caldwell regardless of weather. The whole town came in from the ranches and the farms and the homesteads and sat together in the candle-lit warmth of the church and sang hymns and ate whatever the church women had organized and felt, for a few hours, like a community rather than a collection of individuals surviving the same circumstances. Charlotte sat next to Warren in the pew, which she had not done before, and the physical closeness of it, his shoulder a few inches from hers, the warmth of him, the steadiness of his voice when he knew the words to the hymn, was a quiet, specific happiness that she held carefully, the way you hold something you do not want to spill. After the service, they walked out into the Christmas night, which was clear and bitterly cold and silver with starlight on the snow, and he stopped her at the edge of the churchyard and turned to face her. "I have been thinking about something for a while," he said. She waited. "I am not a man with much to offer in the way of material things," he said. "I have my work and my horse and a piece of land I do not yet own, and I am aware that you have considerably more than that. I want you to know that I have thought about whether that matters to me, and I have decided that it does not in the way you might worry it would. What I mean is, I do not want what you have. I want you, Charlotte, the woman who buys brown thread and argues with county commissioners and makes 12-year-old boys stop in their tracks by reading poetry aloud." "Warren," she said softly. I also want you to know, he continued, because he had clearly thought this through and intended to say all of it, that if you think I am saying this because the money makes it convenient, I would like to point out that I was already thinking about saying this in October before you told me anything. She believed him. That was the remarkable thing. She believed him completely, which was not something she had been capable of for a very long time, and the fact that she believed him was itself the answer to the question he had not quite yet asked. I know, she said. I know you were. He looked at her with those direct, serious brown eyes. Then what do you think? About the thing I have been thinking about saying. She stepped closer to him in the cold, starlit night, close enough that she had to look up to hold his gaze, close enough that the warmth between them was almost tangible. I think, she said, that you should stop thinking about saying it and say it. And he did. He asked her to marry him, without flourish or theater, simply and directly in the way of everything about him, standing in the snow on Christmas Eve in Caldwell, Kansas, with the candlelight still glowing in the church windows behind them. She said yes. She said it without qualification or calculation or any of the careful architecture she normally brought to important decisions. She said it because it was true, because it had been true for longer than she had allowed herself to acknowledge, and because the relief of saying it aloud to the right person felt like putting down something she had been carrying for years. He kissed her then in the cold, and it was gentle and certain, and it tasted like the specific future she had not known she was walking toward when she walked into this town in a plain dress with worn heels and a heart full of careful walls. The engagement was announced on Christmas Day at Mrs. Combs's boarding house, over a dinner that Mrs. Combs had clearly been planning for several weeks based on its lavishness, and Mrs. Combs cried in a contained and dignified way that completely failed to conceal the fact that she was crying, and Charlotte held her hands and smiled and felt, for the first time in years, uncomplicated joy. She wrote to Aldous Crane the following week. The letter was longer than her usual quarterly correspondence and covered several things, including the fact that she was to be married in the spring to a man named Warren Yates, that she would be revisiting the management structure of her various interests to reflect her new circumstances, and that she was planning to remain in Caldwell for the foreseeable future. She suspected Crane would find this collection of information startling. She also suspected he would be professional enough not to say so. His reply came in January, proper and measured and between the lines entirely reassuring. He had heard. He thought the revised management structure she proposed was sensible, and he offered his congratulations on the upcoming marriage. He also noted in the understated way of good attorneys that the lumber interest in Indiana had had an excellent fourth quarter, which he thought she would be pleased to know. She was pleased to know it. She showed the letter to Warren because she had decided deliberately and consciously that she was done keeping separate halves of her life, and Warren read it with the focused attention he brought to everything and asked 3 sharp, practical questions about the lumber business that Aldous Crane himself might have asked, and then nodded slowly. You should expand the Nevada operation, he said. That is exactly what I have been thinking, she said. Crane thinks so too, based on what he wrote last fall. He does. But he is cautious by nature. He needs to be encouraged. Warren looked at her. You enjoy this, running the business. I do, she said, and it was the first time she had said that aloud to anyone. I always have. My father taught me well and I have good instincts and I genuinely enjoy it. I just also genuinely enjoy teaching school and walking to the creek and having a life that is connected to something real. You can have both, he said. I know, she said. That is what I am building. January was cold and long, and there was a week in the middle of it when the temperature dropped far enough that the school had to be closed, because the stove could not keep up with the drafts in the old building, and Charlotte and Warren spent more time together in those gray winter days than they had yet managed, talking by Mrs. Combs's fire and walking, bundled in the brief midday warmth, and once, memorably, when Warren's horse threw a shoe on the road back to the Bartlett ranch, and he had to stay in town an extra night, sitting up past midnight at the kitchen table with a lamp between them, going through the Nevada mining reports together while Mrs. Combs slept soundly upstairs and the cold pressed at the windows. She loved him. She had known it for months, but she named it to herself clearly for the first time that January night, watching him trace his finger along a line of figures in the quarterly report, his brow slightly creased in concentration, his sleeves rolled up despite the cold because he always ran warm, and she thought, I love this man. Plainly, without decoration, in the way of truths that do not require embellishment. She also told him so, a few evenings later, in the parlor with Mrs. Combs's fire crackling and the wind outside, and he looked at her for a moment as though making sure he had heard correctly, and then he said, I have loved you since October, in case you are keeping records. October, she said. October 15th, to be specific. You were arguing with that county commissioner and you had exactly one strand of hair loose from your bonnet and you did not care at all. She laughed. You remember the exact date. I am a detail-oriented person, he said, with the faint smile that was becoming one of her favorite things in the world. February passed and then March came, and with March came two developments that had been building for some time. The first was that Warren went to the Caldwell Farmers and Merchants Bank and sat across the desk from a banker named Horace Whitmore and made his offer on the land that had been his father's. He had worked 2 hard years for that moment, and Whitmore, who was a man who appreciated people who worked for things and met their commitments, accepted the offer and shook Warren's hand across the desk, and Warren rode back to town with the deed in his coat pocket and found Charlotte at the schoolhouse during the children's recess and told her, and the way his face looked when he said it was something she had never seen before, wide open, like a door flung back on a bright morning. She held his hands in the cold spring air outside the schoolhouse and said, You did it. We are going to build a house, he said, which told her everything she needed to know about where his thinking had gone. The second development was a letter that arrived in mid-March from Gerald Fitch, not addressed to Charlotte but forwarded by Aldous Crane, who appended a brief note. This man has made inquiries regarding your interests in Nevada. I thought you should know. He is not a direct threat but bears watching. Charlotte read the letter once, set it down, and wrote back to Crane with specific instructions about what legal structures should be reinforced and what public records should be carefully managed. She had known Fitch was not entirely gone. She had simply not allowed it to dominate her thinking. Now she dealt with it with the clean efficiency of someone who understood that problems you address directly lose most of their power. She told Warren about the letter that same evening. He listened and then asked, Do you need me to do anything? No, she said. I have handled it. I wanted to tell you because I am not keeping things from you. All right, he said. That was, she thought, perhaps the thing she loved most about him. The way he made space for her competence without feeling threatened by it. The way he trusted her to manage what she was capable of managing and stood ready to help with what remained without pushing his way into things that were not his to carry. The wedding was planned for May, which in Kansas is the most generous month the climate offers. The violent spring storms had usually passed, and the brutal summer heat had not yet arrived, and the land was green and wide and full of possibility. Mrs. Combs organized it with the intensity of a general planning a campaign, and Charlotte allowed herself to be organized because she was focusing her energy on 2 other things. The house Warren was building on his land east of town, which she visited every Sunday to watch take shape, and a letter she was composing in her mind to the Caldwell School Board suggesting a succession plan for the school, because she intended to go on teaching after the wedding, but understood that the board would have opinions. The house went up fast because Warren had arranged with the Bartlett Ranch to borrow 3 men for the framing week, and Charlotte's contribution was pragmatic and specific. She ordered a shipment of high-quality lumber from her Indiana operation, through Crane, at cost, which Warren initially protested, until she pointed out that the lumber from Indiana was considerably better than what was available locally, and that she was not going to let the house they were going to live in be built from inferior material. "It is my house too," she said. He thought about this for a moment. "Fair point," he said. She also ordered a parlor stove and a good iron cook stove, and a set of kitchen equipment that arrived from a catalog, and which Warren unpacked with the particular pleasure of a man who is building something real, running his hands along the heavy iron as though confirming that it was genuinely there. The house was not large, but it was well made, and it had east-facing windows that let in the morning light, which Charlotte had specified because she liked to read in the mornings, and a good deep porch that looked out over the bottom land where Warren was planning to put his first cattle. They walked through it together on the May Sunday before the wedding, the two of them alone in the empty rooms, the smell of new wood everywhere, and Charlotte stood in the kitchen with the morning light coming through the windows she had asked for, and felt the particular emotion of a person who has been rootless for a long time standing on solid ground. Warren came to stand beside her. He was looking out the same window at the land that was his and would be theirs, and she could feel the steadiness of him the way you feel the warmth of a fire. "I keep thinking," he said, "about my father. He would have liked you." "What was he like?" she asked. "Stubborn," Warren said. "Practical, fair. He worked hard all his life and did not have much to show for it materially, but he did not miss a day of work, and he did not break his word to anyone, and everyone who knew him spoke well of him after he was gone. I think that counts for something." "It counts for a great deal," she said. He looked at her. He would have said, "She is good all the way through." That is the thing he always said about people he truly respected. She felt the words land somewhere central. "Mrs. Combs said something similar about you," she said. He smiled, the real one that reached his eyes. "Then Mrs. Combs and my father would have agreed, which is probably the best recommendation I could have." She reached for his hand. He took it. They stood there in the morning light of the house that was going to be their life, and there was nothing unresolved between them, nothing held back, and it was the most complete Charlotte had felt in as long as she could remember. The wedding was on the 17th of May, 1883, a Thursday, because Mrs. Combs had determined that Thursdays were less chaotic than Saturdays in Caldwell and more festive than Tuesdays. And the entire town appeared to agree with her reasoning because the Caldwell church was packed to a degree that the minister, Reverend Harlan Birch, said he had not seen since the great tent revival of 1880. Charlotte wore, by deliberate and meaningful choice, a dress that was not plain. She had ordered it from Kansas City, a deep ivory wool with a fitted bodice and a small bustle in the style of the time, and a collar of cream lace that had been her mother's, kept in the locked box all these years alongside the financial letters, the one purely sentimental thing she had carried with her from St. Louis. She wore her hair pinned but softer, with a few pieces left loose at the sides, the way Warren had mentioned in January, without knowing he was saying something significant. When she walked down the aisle of the Caldwell church on the arm of Hector Prout, who had offered because there was no one else and who was visibly moved by the occasion in a way that made his wife cry, she saw Warren standing at the front in a coat she had never seen before, dark brown wool, well-tailored, bought for the occasion, and his face when he saw her was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen on a human being. He looked at her like she was the answer to a question he had forgotten he was asking. She reached him and Hector handed her off and stepped back, and Warren took both her hands in his and looked at her for a long moment before Reverend Birch began, as if he needed a moment to take in the full fact of what was happening, and Charlotte looked back at him with everything she was. "You are beautiful," he said quietly just to her before the ceremony started, not as a preamble to anything, not as performance, just because it was true and he wanted to say it. "You are," she said back. And meant it. The ceremony was traditional and warm, and twice she heard Mrs. Combs audibly failing not to sob from the third pew, and when Reverend Birch pronounced them married and Warren kissed her in front of all of Caldwell, the gathered crowd made a sound that was equal parts delight and relief, as though they had all been watching this particular tide come in and were glad to see it arrive. The celebration afterward was at Mrs. Combs's boarding house, which she had transformed for the occasion with ribbons, and a table full of food that she had been preparing for days, and which included a cake that was, by any measure, a remarkable achievement for a frontier kitchen. Several of the ranch hands from the Bartlett operation came, and some of the school families, and Hector Prout gave a toast that was both heartfelt and slightly incoherent, and Warren's response was precise and simple, and made Charlotte's eyes fill in a way she had not anticipated. He said, "I have spent most of my life working towards something I could hold on to. I did not know until recently that the most important thing I would hold on to would find me first." She threaded her fingers through his under the table, and he squeezed them once, and that was enough. They drove out to their house that evening in the late spring light, their things loaded in the back of the wagon, the land gold and green on either side of the road. Charlotte had her locked box on her lap, as she had carried it for 2 years, except now it seemed lighter. Not because anything in it had changed, but because she was no longer carrying it alone. Summer arrived early and hot, as Kansas summers do, and the rhythms of their life together established themselves with a naturalness that Charlotte found she had not quite expected. Not because she had expected difficulty, but because she had not known what ease between two people who were both independent and capable and private actually felt like in daily practice. It turned out to feel like this, like a conversation that could pause and resume without losing its thread, like the particular comfort of knowing that the person in the other room is there and does not require constant tending, like Sunday mornings at the kitchen table with coffee and the week's mail, and a comfortable silence that was full of its own specific warmth. She continued to teach school. The board had accepted her succession proposal with minor revisions, and she had identified a young woman from one of the homestead families who had the temperament for teaching, and was helping to train her as an assistant. She continued to manage her financial interests, the letters to Crane going back and forth with the same regularity, now from the farmhouse east of town, rather than from a boarding house room. Warren expanded the conversation about Nevada into a full strategic review of all her holdings. He had an instinct for what was sound and what was not that she trusted completely, and their discussions at the kitchen table after supper became, over the course of that summer, something that resembled a partnership of genuine equals, each bringing something different to the same purpose. He also began his cattle operation, starting small with a herd of 23 that he purchased from the Bartlett operation at a fair price, and Charlotte stood at the fence on a September morning, watching the cattle settle onto the land that had been his father's, and felt something she could only describe as rightness, the specific rightness of a thing being what it was supposed to be. In October, exactly 1 year after the night she had told herself she could trust him, Charlotte realized she was expecting a child. She sat with this knowledge for 2 days, holding it quietly the way she held everything important, turning it over and examining it from all sides. And then on a Tuesday evening when Warren came in from the land and sat down at the supper table, and she put his plate in front of him and stayed standing rather than sitting down, he looked up at her with the attentiveness that always caught her off guard even now, and he said, "Something has happened." "Nothing bad," she said quickly. "Warren, we are going to have a child." He was still for a moment. Then he stood up from the table, not dramatically, just rose to his full height and crossed the small space between them and held her. He held her with the specific solidity of someone who understood that this was something she would need to be held for, not just celebrated at. She pressed her face against his shoulder and felt, through the warm cotton of his shirt, the steady, strong rhythm of his heart. "Are you all right?" he said. "I am very all right," she said, which was true in the deepest possible way. He pulled back to look at her face, both hands cupping her face, the way he had only done a handful of times before, when he wanted to be sure she was seeing what he was trying to say. "I have been thinking," he said, "that this house is going to need to be larger." She laughed, sudden and real, the good laugh she had relearned in Caldwell. "We have months yet," she said. "I know," he said. "I am already thinking about it." He was already thinking about it. She looked at this man, her husband, still a word that was new enough to be specific, and felt the fullness of what they had built together in this short time. The house, the land, the cattle, the school, the mining reports on the kitchen table, the Sunday mornings and the Tuesday evenings, and the nights when the prairie wind came across the high plains, and the world contracted to the small, warm circle of a single lamp. She had spent 2 years hiding everything that was real about her behind the plainest possible exterior, because experience had taught her that visibility meant loss, that to be known was to be used. And what she had found, walking into Caldwell in a worn heeled boot and a dishwater dress to buy brown thread, was that the right person saw through the plain dress, not because he was looking for what was behind it, but because he was paying the kind of attention that sees people as they actually are. He had loved the plain dress. He had loved the woman in the plain dress. The rest of it, the lumber empire, the mining interest, the balance sheets, had never been the point. The winter of 1883 was mild by Kansas standards, which was to say it was cold but not punishing, and Charlotte expanded the farmhouse parlor while Warren put up an additional section of fencing on the eastern boundary of the land, and they were both busy with the specific productive busyness of people who have a great deal they are building toward. She wrote to Aldous Crane with several decisions that she had been developing over the preceding months, the most significant of which was a consolidation of the lumber operation that she and Warren had discussed extensively, and which both of them believed would improve the overall profitability while reducing some of the exposure to unstable timber markets in the East. Crane wrote back to say that she was correct and that he would proceed as instructed. She had started, without remarking on it to anyone, to include Warren's analysis in the letters to Crane, not as Warren's opinion specifically, but as the refined thinking that emerged from their kitchen table conversations. Crane, who was a perceptive man, had said in his most recent letter, "Your strategic thinking has been particularly sharp these past several months. Whatever you have been doing, continue it." She smiled when she read that and showed it to Warren, who read it with the same focused attention and said, "He is a good attorney." "He is," she said, "and he is not wrong." The baby was born in late April of 1884, with Mrs. Combs in attendance and a doctor named Beardsley who had recently set up practice in Caldwell. And it was a boy, which Warren did not expect, and which produced in him a specific quality of stunned quiet that Charlotte found more moving than any dramatic expression would have been. They named him Elias, for her father, which was Warren's suggestion, made the evening after the birth when Charlotte was resting, and the baby was sleeping in the cradle Warren had made over the winter from a piece of particularly fine walnut, an extravagance he had quietly commissioned because he had wanted to make it himself, and walnut was what the situation called for. "Elias Yates," Charlotte said, considering it. "It is a good strong name," Warren said. "And it is right that it should carry your father forward. Your father's name was Daniel," she said. "It was. If we have another boy," she said, "he will be Daniel." Warren looked at her over the sleeping baby, and the tenderness in his face was something she did not have adequate words for. Young Elias Yates proved, from his first months, to be a child of considerable opinion and tremendous determination, which Charlotte found deeply familiar and Warren found both endearing and, on certain nights, exhausting. He grew well and fast, and by the time he was walking, the farmhouse seemed to have reorganized itself around his movements, the way small, energetic persons reorganize any space they occupy. Charlotte did not stop teaching. She had reduced her hours as Elias grew, and as her assistant, a young woman named Ruth Mallory, took on more of the daily instruction. But she continued to walk into Caldwell 3 mornings a week and sit with the students and teach the older children the subjects Ruth had not yet fully mastered: literature and advanced mathematics and the history of the world beyond the Kansas horizon. She also, in the spring of 1885, made a trip to Nevada. It was the first time she had physically visited the mining operation since before she came to Caldwell, and she went with Warren, which meant leaving Elias, who was just over a year old, with Mrs. Combs for 2 weeks, and which Mrs. Combs received as the honor she clearly considered it to be. The Nevada trip was business, and it was also something else. It was the first time Warren saw the full scope of what Charlotte had built and inherited, not as numbers on a page but as a physical, working reality. He stood at the entrance to the main shaft of the Merritt silver operation in the Nevada high desert and looked at the scale of it, the workers, the equipment, the supervisor named McKay, who spoke to Charlotte with the respectful directness of a man who knew he was talking to someone who understood his work. And he was quiet for a long time. On the way back to the hotel that evening, he said, "You have always understood all of this." "My father made sure of it," she said. "You could have done anything," he said, "gone anywhere, had any life you chose." "I did choose," she said. "I chose Caldwell. I chose the plain dress and the brown thread in the schoolhouse." "And the man with the blue thread," he said. She looked at him. His profile against the Nevada evening, the line of his jaw, the way the last light caught the lines at the corners of his eyes. This man who had driven cattle up the Chisholm Trail and worked other men's ranches, and saved 2 years' wages for his father's land, and made a walnut cradle over a winter and read David Copperfield by himself in a trail camp, and seen her clearly from the very beginning. "Yes," she said. "And the man with the blue thread." He reached across and took her hand where it lay on the seat of the carriage, and they rode back to the hotel in the high Nevada dark with the stars spread enormous overhead. And she thought, not for the first time but more completely than before, that there was no version of any life she could imagine that she would choose over this one. Gerald Fitch made one more appearance in their life, in the summer of 1885, not in person, but in a legal document that Crane forwarded with a carefully worded letter. Fitch had apparently decided to pursue a formal claim against one of the Merritt lumber interests in Indiana, based on a contract dispute from the period following Elias Merritt's death, claiming that he had been party to a verbal agreement that had not been honored. Charlotte read the documents at the kitchen table on a June evening with Elias playing with a set of carved wooden blocks on the floor at her feet and Warren reading across from her, and she worked through the legal language with the focused efficiency that legal language always brought out in her, and then she set the papers down and said, "He has no case." "What is the basis of his claim?" Warren asked. She explained it. A supposed verbal agreement with her father about a joint investment in a particular stand of timber in southern Indiana, made in the months before Elias Merritt's death. The problem with the claim, from Fitch's perspective, was that Charlotte had her father's papers in full, including his private correspondence, and there was nothing in those papers that corroborated any such agreement. "He is gambling," Warren said. "He has always gambled," she said. "He is hoping I will settle rather than litigate because litigation would expose details of my holdings." "But litigation would also expose him," Warren said. "Exactly." She looked at him. "I am not going to settle." "No," he said. She wrote to Crane with instructions to proceed through the courts if Fitch pushed the claim, and to make it clear to Fitch's legal representation that she would not be moved. Crane communicated this, and 2 months later Fitch withdrew the claim without any settlement. Charlotte received Crane's notification letter on a Tuesday morning, read it, set it down on the kitchen table, and went back to correcting her students' arithmetic exercises. Warren saw the letter at supper and read Crane's brief note. He set it down and said, "Well." "Well," she agreed. "He will not be back," Warren said. "No," she said. "He has learned what he needed to learn." "What is that?" She looked up from the exercise papers. "That I am not afraid of him." He looked at her for a moment, and then the smile came, the real one, deep in his eyes. "No," he said, "you are not." Elias Yates grew into a bright and sturdy boy who had his mother's eyes and his father's steady attention and a laugh that could fill the whole farmhouse. And in the fall of 1886, when Elias was 2 and a half, Charlotte told Warren that they were expecting again. This time he was not stunned. He was simply glad, openly and straightforwardly, and held her in the farmhouse kitchen on an October morning with the coffee on the stove and the sound of Elia's boots on the floor upstairs, and said, "This house is large enough. You built it large enough," she said. "I built it for whatever we became," he said. The second child was a girl, born in April of 1887, and they named her Clara. No particular reason beyond that it suited her from the first moment. A small, serious person with dark eyes who looked at the world from the beginning, with the kind of attentive scrutiny that Warren recognized in her mother. And that made him laugh quietly in the evenings when Clara sat in Charlotte's lap and studied whatever was in front of her with total focused gravity. By 1888, Warren's cattle operation had grown substantially. He had made smart decisions about when to sell and when to hold, and the land east of the Cimarron that had started as 340 acres had expanded twice. First with the purchase of a neighboring parcel from a homesteader who had decided to go back east, and then with the acquisition of water rights that turned out to be the most valuable thing he had done, giving the ranch access that other operations in the area would spend years trying to negotiate. Charlotte continued to manage the Merritt interests. The lumber business had been consolidated and was running efficiently under a manager Crane had found, a competent man in Indianapolis who sent detailed monthly reports and needed minimal supervision. The Nevada mining operation was in its most productive period yet, and Charlotte had made the decision to invest part of the proceeds into the expansion of the Caldwell school, which was becoming inadequate for the growing population of the surrounding area. She did this through a trust arrangement that Crane set up, one that made the funding anonymous, which she did because she wanted the school to benefit without the attendant political complications of a wealthy patron, and which Warren fully supported, though he privately noted, with the faint smile she still loved, that she was still hiding things behind plain dresses, just different kinds. "I am not hiding," she said. "I am simply strategic. The plain dress is more strategic now," he said. "It always was," she said. "The school expanded." Ruth Mallory, who was now the primary teacher, hired an assistant of her own, and Charlotte moved into a role that was somewhere between advisor and visiting instructor, which suited her completely. She came in 2 mornings a week and taught the oldest students advanced subjects, and felt, every time she did it, that this was one of the things she was specifically here in the world to do. In the fall of 1888, on an October evening that Charlotte would remember for the rest of her life, she and Warren sat on the farmhouse porch as the sun went down over the Kansas plains in the way it goes down in autumn, slowly, broadly, with colors that seemed too large for even the wide prairie sky to contain. Elias was inside doing the homework Charlotte had assigned him, grumbling in a quiet way that meant he was actually doing it. Clara was asleep, having collapsed in the late afternoon with the sudden completeness of young children. The land stretched out ahead of them, golden in the last light, the cattle moving in the far distance. Warren was sitting in the chair he always sat in, his long legs extended, his coffee cup resting on the arm. Charlotte was beside him. They had been quiet for a while, the good quiet that was itself a form of conversation. She thought about the morning she had walked into a general store in this town with worn-heeled boots and a plain dress, and the deliberate invisibility of a woman protecting herself from the world, and how the world had found her anyway, and how it had turned out to be this porch, this land, this man, this life. She thought about brown thread and blue thread and a voice that said "Pardon me," and meant it simply, without agenda. "What are you thinking about?" Warren asked. She looked at him in the evening light. 6 years since they had first met across a shelf of thread in Hector Prute's store. Her husband, the father of her children, her partner in everything that mattered. "The general store," she said. He tilted his head slightly. "The thread." "The thread," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Then, I knew even then I could not have said what I knew, but I knew something. You said pardon me and reached past my elbow," she said. "It was a very important piece of thread," he said. She laughed, and it was the laugh she had relearned here, real and unguarded, the one that still, after all these years, gave her a small surprised pleasure at its own existence. "Warren," she said. "Yes. I want to tell you something." He looked at her, giving her his full attention the way he always had from the very beginning, without reservation or qualification. "When I came here," she said, "I thought I was protecting myself. I thought the plain dress and the plain life were a defense. And they were for a while. But what I did not understand then, what I could not have understood because I had not met you yet, was that the life was not just a defense. It was real. The dress was real. The school was real. This was real." She made a small gesture that took in the porch and the land and the house and the evening. "I came to Caldwell to hide, but I stayed in Caldwell because I found it." He was looking at her steadily. "And you found me," she said. "You found the plain dress, and you loved it before you knew what was behind it, and I need you to know that that mattered. That is the thing that made it possible for me to trust again. That is the thing that gave me back myself." He reached over and took her hand. His fingers laced through hers, the familiar warmth of it. "You never needed me to give you back yourself," he said. "You had yourself the whole time. You just needed somewhere safe enough to bring it out. And you made it safe," she said. "We made it safe," he said. They sat in the October evening as the sky moved through its colors and the stars began to appear in the east, one by one, the way they always appeared over the Kansas plains. Gradually, then all at once, filling the dark with more light than you expect when you are standing in the small lamplight of a single life. Inside the house, Elias called from his room with a question about a word in his homework, and Warren got up to go answer it, and Charlotte stayed on the porch for a moment in the last of the light, looking out over the land that was theirs, the land that her father had indirectly helped build with what he left her, and that Warren had built with his hands and his years. And she felt the deep and specific happiness of a woman who has found exactly what she came looking for. Even though she had not known what it was when she left, she went inside. The lamp was warm and the children were real, and Warren was in Elias' room explaining a word with patient thoroughness, his voice low and clear, and she stood in the hallway for a moment just listening to it. Then she went into the kitchen and started supper, and the farmhouse filled with the sounds and smells of an ordinary evening, which was to say it filled with everything. And outside the Kansas sky went dark and full of stars, and the land lay quiet and vast in all directions, and this was their life. Plain and extraordinary, hidden and fully known, a fortune finally and completely spent on the right thing. Spring came to the Yates farm in 1889 as it always did, suddenly and with great color, the prairie waking up from the winter with a kind of determined urgency that Charlotte had come to love after nearly 7 years in Kansas. There were wildflowers along the creek that Elias, now 4, had learned to identify by name from a book she had ordered from Chicago, and Clara, at 2, followed her brother on his educational expeditions with the focused seriousness that was becoming the most reliable thing about her. Charlotte was in the schoolhouse that April morning when the letter arrived from Aldous Crane, and she did not read it until the midday break, sitting on the schoolhouse steps in the warm spring air. It was longer than usual, and it contained news that was not entirely unexpected but was significant. The Indiana Lumber Company had received a purchase offer from a large regional operation that wanted to consolidate several smaller companies into a single enterprise. The offer was substantial. Crane laid out the terms carefully and offered his analysis, which was favorable, and asked for her instruction. She sat with the letter in her lap for a long time, listening to the children playing behind the schoolhouse, watching a hawk work its slow circles above the spring-green land to the east. That evening she showed the letter to Warren. He read it at the kitchen table with Elias on his lap, the boy leaning over to look at the paper with the solemn interest of a child who has decided that letters are important because his parents spend so much time with them. "What do you think?" she asked. Warren read it through again. He set it down. He looked at the figures Crane had quoted. He thought for a while. "The lumber business has always been the most complicated piece to manage at this distance," he said. "The Nevada mining has a good manager and runs itself mostly. The lumber requires more attention." "That is my assessment as well," she said. "And the offer is fair. More than fair," she said. "Crane thinks it is excellent." "What does your instinct say?" She had been carrying her instinct around all afternoon. "Take it," she said. "Simplify. Keep Nevada, keep the Chicago account, and use part of the proceeds to expand what we are building here." He looked at her for a moment, and something in his expression was the particular thing she had come to love most about him: the complete absence of any impulse to treat her decisions as things that required his approval rather than his engagement. "I think you are right," he said. "Tell Crane to proceed." She wrote to Crane the following morning, and the sale was completed over the next several months. Smooth and profitable, and exactly as she had said, a simplification that clarified rather than diminished. The proceeds went in part into expanding the Yates cattle operation, which Warren received as the natural thing it was: the partnership of two people who had built something together and would continue to build it together, and in part into a fund Charlotte established quietly for the Caldwell school district that would ensure Ruth Mallory's salary and the school's operational costs for the next decade, without requiring annual lobbying of county commissioners. That last piece gave her a particular satisfaction, the kind that comes from solving a problem thoroughly rather than partially. Clara, at 3, developed the habit of sitting beside her mother when Charlotte wrote letters, with her own small piece of paper and a pencil, doing her version of correspondence. Serious lines and shapes that she described as letters to specific people, including one to the hawk that lived above the east field, which Charlotte received with the gravity the correspondence deserved and promised to deliver. Elias, at 5, had learned to read well enough to work through simple books on his own, and had the habit of reading aloud to Clara in the evenings, which Clara accepted as her natural due. Warren sometimes stopped whatever he was doing and just listened to his son's reading voice, with an expression that Charlotte understood completely. It was the expression of a man who had taught himself from a trail boss's discarded Dickens novel and was hearing, in his son's easy fluency, something healed. The years settled into themselves with the particularity of real time, not smooth or undifferentiated, but textured with the specific events and seasons and small transformations that make a life recognizable as itself. The summer of 1890 was dry, and they worried about the cattle range and drilled a new well that proved productive. The winter of 1891 brought a proper blizzard that confined the whole family to the farmhouse for 4 days, which Elias declared an adventure, and Clara survived with composure, and Warren handled by reading the entire available library aloud in rotation, and Charlotte handled by teaching both children everything she knew about long division. In the spring of 1892, Charlotte was 38 years old and Warren was 39 and Elias was 7 and Clara was 5, and the Yates farm was the best-run cattle operation in that part of Sumner County by general agreement, and the Caldwell school was thriving. And on a May morning that was as clear and generous as the morning of her wedding 9 years before, Charlotte stood at the kitchen window watching Warren and Elias walk the fence line together, Elias 3 steps to his father's 1. Talking with the serious intensity of a 7-year-old who has much to explain about the world. She thought about everything that had brought her to this window, this house, this life. The plain dress deliberately chosen, the worn boots, the brown thread, the deliberate invisibility of a woman who had been afraid of being seen and had found in being seen anyway, not the loss she had feared but the thing she had not known to want. She thought about her father who had taught her to read a balance sheet, and also in everything he was to read people, to look at them carefully and see what was actually there rather than what was presented. He had been right about most things. She thought he would have been right about this. She went outside. The May morning received her with warmth and the smell of the prairie coming alive, and she walked down to the fence line where Warren and Elias were, and Elias turned when he heard her coming and ran the last 20 yards to meet her, the way he had since he could run, with total uncalculating abandon. She caught him. She held him. Over his head, Warren was watching her with those brown eyes that had been direct and steady and genuinely seeing since the first morning in the general store, and she looked back at him and felt the fullness of the life they had made. Complete, resolved, entirely itself, with nothing hidden and nothing held back and nothing in the locked box that was not also held openly between them. Warren walked over. He put his arm around her, Elias between them and Clara appearing from around the side of the house with the purposeful trot of a child with specific intentions. "What is she carrying?" Charlotte said. Warren looked. "I believe that is a frog," he said. "Clara," Charlotte called. Clara arrived and looked up at both of them with the gray-green eyes that were entirely her mother's. In her hands, calmly held, was indeed a frog. It appeared to be fine with the arrangement. "I have a frog," Clara said. "So I see," Charlotte said. "What is its name?" Clara considered. "Daniel," she said. Warren made a sound that he converted quickly into a cough. Charlotte looked at him with the particular look of a woman who has lived with someone long enough to know exactly what a converted cough means, and he met her eyes with the real smile, the deep one, and she felt it in her chest the same way she had felt it the first time, and the time after that, and every time since. This was what she had hidden behind the plain dress. Not the lumber empire or the mining interest or the balance sheets, but this. The capacity for this. For frog naming and fence walking and long division blizzards and books read aloud in a farmhouse in Kansas. The capacity for an ordinary extraordinary life with an extraordinary ordinary man who had seen her clearly from across a shelf of thread, and had never once looked at her the way she had always feared to be looked at. He had simply looked at her, and she had looked back, and that was the whole of it, and it was more than enough, and it was everything. The Kansas spring opened wide around them, and the land stretched out in every direction, and their children were real and loud and present, and between Charlotte Merritt, Charlotte Yates now, though she still signed the Crane letters with both names because the business world required it, and because it honored her father and Warren Yates, there was nothing concealed and nothing unresolved. Only the long, specific warmth of two people who had found each other in a frontier town by a shelf of thread, and had been finding each other, daily and deliberately, ever since. The frog, for what it was worth, was released back to the creek by dinner time. Clara supervised the release with appropriate ceremony, and Elias documented it in a small notebook he had decided to keep of significant events. Warren rebuilt the loose section of fence he had identified that morning. Charlotte made supper from what they had simple things, good things, and the farmhouse filled with light and the sound of the family they had made together. And outside, the prairie went on in all directions, vast and indifferent and deeply alive, as it had always been, as it would go on being long after them. The sky enormous overhead, the grass bending in the wind off the high plains, the stars waiting beyond the blue, patient and permanent, marking the time between the things that matter.